Many people talk about the ups and downs of married life, but no one really prepares you for life after your spouse passes away. Welcome to Widowhood Real Talk with Tina, a safe place for widows, widowers, and their friends and family to talk about love and loss. Find comfort as you listen to honest conversations between Tina and invited guests who've experienced the loss of their forever partner. Share their stories of love, grief, and healing. You are not alone in this journey. Join today's episode and discover a wealth of resources and learn how to connect with others who are traveling the same path. This is Widowhood Real Talk with Tina.
Hello, Jeanette. Welcome to the Widowhood.
Hi, Tina. Thank you so much for having me tonight.
I am glad to have this conversation. You can tell people how I tracked you down on the internet and stalked you to be here because I have no shame about that because I am always intentionally looking for people that have a voice, people that have something to share that will provide encouragement for other people. And when I saw you, I believe it was on Twitter is where I stalked you at, and said this would be a good voice to bring to the widowhood. So thank you for not thinking I was some kind of internet creeper or something like that. It was okay.
Absolutely not. No, I'm happy to connect. And yeah, I think we did connect on Twitter. You know, it's been a really great resource. Grief Twitter is a real thing, and it's been a huge resource in my healing.
Thank you for saying that. And actually, before we get into your story, just on that topic, as far as the internet, I know a lot of times people say, well, I don't want to be on the internet. I don't want to be doing all these things. Elaborate a little bit more how the internet or social media has been a positive and helpful resource for you.
Sure. So I was widowed 9 years ago in 2014, in the fall of 2014. And while there was a local widow support group, everyone was 30 or 40 years older than me. And our challenges just weren't the same. I was raising two young kids. And while I did get support from that group initially, the generational difference was hard to kind of meet in the middle, and it was hard because when you're 60 or 70, your issues and needs as a widowed person are very different than a 35-year-old. So I had to go to the internet because that was the only place I could find other young widowed parents, and that's how I started Widowed Parent Project, was actually looking for community that was going through similar struggles as widows and as parents raising grieving children.
Thank you. So let's talk about how your husband met, how you and your husband met, or who you were before you even met him. Like, what were some of your interests? Because the grief is part of our story, but it's not all of who we are. So I want to just who you are as a person.
Sure. So, well, before I met him, we were 15 when we met. So
Wow.
we had 21 years together. He was my high school sweetheart. So I don't know what my adult self would have been like without him, but we grew up together. So we were very young when we met. We were sophomores in high school. First day of sophomore year, we met. Um, and so it was really hard for me to know what my life was like before Mark. It was my childhood. I mean, we grew up together, and so in that sense, when I lost him, I didn't know how to adult without him, and that's been part of my widow journey, is learning how to be alone and how to make decisions alone and those kinds of things. But we met in high school Spanish class, and we were together for 21 years.
Now, my late husband's name is also Mark, which
I
I
remember
thought
that.
was very interesting. And you touch on something regarding when your Mark passed, and adulting and decision making, and also identity. Would you share just how you came about realizing about making choices on your own, and how you just became comfortable in that, what that process was like for you?
Sure. So Mark and I had 21 years together. As I said, we were married 12. We got married when we were 24, and like I said, I really didn't have he we had a very codependent relationship. I guess it wasn't the healthiest relationship. I think when you get together that young, it not sometimes isn't. And we were actually separated the year before he died. So we were separated for 13 months, but our marriage was in the process of some deep healing. I think we both felt. We were not divorcing, but we were living apart while going to marriage counseling. And so it was actually that year prior to his death that I learned how to live alone. And I look back and I thank God that I had that year, because I think if I had lost him the way I lost him, and I hadn't learned how to sleep alone, I hadn't learned how to take care of myself alone, I hadn't learned how to go out to eat alone, like I think it would have been that much harder for me when he died. And so in some ways, I think that year, I don't know, I tell myself God was preparing me to learn how to be alone, and I needed some staggered time to do that. So it was some difficult circumstances under which he died, and part of that was that we were separated when he died, which is also something that I think really informed who I am now and how my identity shifted after being widowed, because there was a lot of complicating factors.
Okay. Interesting. I can relate to feeling like God had a hand in preparing. My husband Mark was working in Virginia and I was living in Pennsylvania.
Mm.
So I was getting used to him being gone. I was in the process of trying to find a job and move to Virginia. But I too, when he passed, I was like, there was some preparation involved in being someplace else and doing something. I considered that as a gift if I could look at it that way instead of how it could have been differently. And everybody's circumstance is different, but I tried to lean into go, what could I be appreciative for in this process, because we all have to leave this world at some point in time. So I can understand that.
Yeah, and it was really, it didn't feel like a gift in the beginning. I had a lot of guilt, but as
Mm,
I did a lot of therapy and worked through some of that, I was really able to see, how lucky I was in some ways that I had that year to really focus on me. I had the best mental health I've ever had that year. Prior to his death, I was in a really good place. And I think that if he had died at any other point in time, particularly at the start of our separation, I think the psychological toll that would have taken on me would have been that much harder to cope with.
right. Thank you. And thank you for mentioning about guilt, because I know oftentimes people struggle with guilt when their spouses die. And it could seem like there was nothing to be guilty about. It was the time. But how did guilt start manifesting in your life for you?
That's a really important question to talk about, and I think it's one that we don't share enough about as widowed people. So, one of the parts of this journey that I've been on the last few years is wanting to talk about authenticity and grief. And that means talking about guilt, it means talking about shame, it means talking about the fact that a lot of people didn't have perfect marriages, and there's kind of this thing that I've noticed happens in the widow community where we put the dead on a pedestal, right? And we say we can't talk bad about, no ill talk about the dead. And in some ways I think that does a disservice, because then we keep secrets to ourselves, and we have to, there's so much isolation and grief already, that then not being able to be honest about what we're going through adds another layer to that. So it's been important for me to talk about the guilt I felt and the shame I felt when he died because of the separation. So Mark died of a sudden unexplained death in epilepsy, which is a rare condition within epilepsy. He had just been diagnosed about a year and a half before he died. So I had guilt that we didn't notice his disease sooner or wasn't diagnosed in time. And I had guilt that, I left my husband when he was chronically ill. And that wasn't the reason I left him, but it was a contributing factor, right? Epilepsy very commonly is comorbid with depression, which he suffered from his whole life. And going through his illness really made his depression that much worse, to the point where it was no longer safe for us to live with him,
Mm,
my children and I, and he was not safe in caring for himself. And so that played a big role in our separation. And so I had guilt that I wasn't a good enough partner, even as a separated partner, that I wasn't a good enough friend, and that I wasn't there when he died. I think the hardest part for me was we were together 21 years, and he died 2 blocks from my house in the middle of the night alone. And that is what stayed with me and what really ate me up. And this belief that somehow I could have changed his fate. If I had been there that night, if he had come home like I asked him that night, um, he had said to me, the last I talked to him that evening before, was that it was time for him to do what I've been asking him to do, which was learn to take care of himself, and that he didn't need me to mother him. He needed to learn how to handle his illness alone. and then he died that night. And so the guilt I felt that, like, did I
Mm,
put this unfair expectation on him? I should have made sure he had a roommate, all these things I thought I could control in his life, which I really couldn't. Those were also his decisions to make about his health. And I still think, one of the things I was told by the Epilepsy Foundation after he died is that the sudden unexplained death is sudden. That's why it's the name of it. There was nothing that anyone could have witnessed or reversed if I had been there. I couldn't have saved him. But I think I lived with that guilt of he died on my watch, right? He was my best friend, my life partner, my co parent. And even though our marriage was not in the best place, I had maintained to him that I loved him unconditionally, but our marriage would have conditions going forward. And so I think it was hard too because people assumed if we were separated, I didn't love him. And that was not true at all. And I think sometimes he felt that way. And that was also not true. So there was just a lot of layers of guilt and shame for me when he died that I should have done more for him in his death.
thank you for sharing that. And I believe that falls underneath the category of disenfranchised grief. It is
Right.
that type of grief that society doesn't give us space to be honest about. And when you're trying to discuss that, people kind of hush that kind of grief away. They want it to look perfect, that there was, but what is perfect and who is perfect? So the reason that that exists is very disheartening. And you're right, grieving, you're already isolated. You don't need those other different layers to make it more complicated and make it feel like you're even more isolated and trying to find a safe space. And that is why I wanted to have real conversations with people because just like you said, going to the internet, I know that there are people that their loved ones have passed and they are looking to see if they're alone in their situation. Is there someone else that's somewhat similar and sharing a story that they can connect with? And this conversation will let somebody know 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. We know what it's like when you can't sleep and you're looking for information to be able to see there are other people that have been on this journey and they're not alone. Thank you for sharing that. Do you feel like there's any guilt or let me ask you this. Do you feel as if the possibility for guilt and shame still hovers sometimes, or is that something that's totally gone forever?
So I've done a lot of healing in the last 9 years, including some trauma therapy, which was necessary to help me. I was the one that found his body, so I also had some post-traumatic stress from what happened that morning. We had the separation. I had actually had several other major losses in the years preceding our separation and his death. I had 4 other deaths of people very close to me, and so there was just a lot to unpack. And one of the things, you know, it took me until year 7 to really get the space in my own life as a widow parent to focus on my healing. So my kids went to therapy and we went to family therapy in the beginning. And the most important thing to me was that they had good mental health care. I was willing to do whatever was necessary at whatever cost because I thought the most important thing, if I can't prevent this trauma from coming in their life through the loss of their dad, and they were with me when I found him, so they had an added trauma component as well, um, was that I could help them recover and I could give them the resources and tools to recover. So I focused on the kids and I, had 2 jobs and I did all of the survival things. And it wasn't until I got to year 6 or 7 post loss where I finally was able to do my own deep healing. And it was there that, with the trauma therapist, where I was able to really unpack the guilt and the shame. And it does still creep in, as does the anger, because there were also some things, secrets that Mark was keeping from me, that I found out later in regards to his health status, or he had not wanted the kids to tell me that he was having seizures again because he was afraid that I would, take them away and he wouldn't have custody then. And so there was just a lot of things to feel guilty about. So it definitely played into it. And what's been interesting is I've gone out and talked more openly about our story. I just came back from Camp Widow in November and I spoke on authenticity and grief there. And every single person I met at Camp Widow, whether it was in that workshop or somewhere else, when I talk about guilt, they talk about their guilt. Every parent I've interviewed for my book, many of whom had really good marriages that didn't have these kinds of problems, talk about the guilt of their partner dying. I think it's a normal part of our grief. I've not met any widowed person that when I've broached the topic of guilt hasn't shared with me what they're holding inside. So I think even if you had, a great marriage, a perfect marriage, the ideal relationship, they're still holding guilt. And so then for those of us that didn't, or, I've had people tell me, well, we got in a fight and then he died in a car accident when he left the house. Or the last thing I said to her was something, I don't even remember. It wasn't important, but I didn't say I love you. And they have guilt about that. And so I do think it is, it's a common theme in grief and something that I don't know that you can fully heal until you're willing to kind of confront the guilt and the shame that you might be carrying.
I would agree. And thank you for sharing that, because there is, I think, a concept that if you do this, that will never happen again.
Right.
And the idea of saying it does have a way of sort of creeping in, and you have to use those coping tools and those things that you learn to sort of reset your mind and say, this is what the truth is, not the head chatter that wants to
Right.
try to slip in. My husband, Mark, had a heart attack and we were together. And I'm CPR certified, all these different things, retired officer in the military. I didn't have the capacity to stop what was inevitable. And that originally for me was like, it took a while. It took me time to be honest about how I was feeling. And then if I'm feeling this way, how do I change this narrative to
Right.
what the truth is? And there are still moments when people talk about different things. It's like, had to come to the conclusion we all have an appointed day, moment, and time. And no matter how skilled or whatever you have, you cannot prevent that. So I can definitely relate to that. Would you mind speaking about the difference between the trauma therapy that you receive versus what someone may think as regular therapists? Because
Sure.
that may help somebody understand if they need that in regards to what they're dealing with.
Sure. So one of the things that, if there was another blessing in our situation, it was that I was working as a trauma educator at the time. And so I worked in the child welfare field in New York. I knew trauma therapists. I have a degree in trauma counseling. So I was very privileged in that I knew who to call to go for this kind of assessment. And because as I said, I was the one that found his body and I tried to resuscitate him for 45 minutes to no avail. And the police had to break down the door. My kids were there. And it was a very difficult situation in addition to just the loss of him. Um, I knew from my own background that my kids probably needed some psychological first aid. And I knew I was going to need psychological first aid. And so I had reached out early, like the first week, to a trauma therapist that I knew and told her what had happened. And she agreed that I should probably sometime in the next month come in and get an assessment at least to see, what we might need. Um, we also, my children and I did do kind of regular grief therapy, if you will. There's a local bereavement center. 6 months after he died, they had a family support group. So we did that. That was 6 weeks. And that was helpful, but different than trauma therapy. The trauma therapy and traumatic grief, which is, I don't like to say it's any more severe than regular grief, it's just different than regular grief. Traumatic grief will have a component of that added trauma where there is usually some type of intrusive thoughts, flashbacks. There may be a replaying and a reliving and a re-experiencing that happens. So it's more of the symptomology that you're having after the loss, in addition to the overwhelming sadness and the loneliness and the isolation and the anger that comes with normative grief. With traumatic grief, you also have, this reliving of the experience of the death. So for us, we went to see this trauma counselor. She was a specialist in children. Um, she looked, met with both of my kids individually in a playroom setting and decided that one of them was probably okay, hadn't witnessed as much, whereas the other one probably would benefit from some trauma therapy. And so we made a decision to, also based on what I could afford, if it's private pay. So the older one went into trauma therapy with her. The younger one stayed connected to, we had just connected her to a child psychologist to help her with the separation. She was having some struggles with that, had one session with that therapist before he died. And I had to call her back and say, So yeah, that was going to be difficult enough. Now her dad just died. Like, can you help this child? Are you skilled enough? And she said, yes, I think I can. And so she saw my 5-year-old, and the other child went with the trauma therapist. And I think, being the ages they were at 5 and 9, that was helpful at that age. What we found over time was it was actually the reverse. My oldest child did not develop post traumatic stress disorder. My youngest child did. And she was the one that later needed more intensive therapy to help her cope with that. And like I said, I focused so much on the kids the first 5 years that by the time I was really struggling, and I knew I needed more therapy. It was kind of just an issue of like waiting for the time and space in my life to deal with it, because trauma therapy is also a little bit different. At least one of the things that's changing now is they're changing to a model where you do more of an intensive trauma treatment in like a retreat style. So imagine like taking a week of your life, and instead of going on vacation, you go see a therapist 8 hours a day with some breaks. But instead of having to open and close every hour, once a month, you're doing your therapy intensively to kind of work through what happened. And so that was ultimately what I ended up doing, was kind of a mix of therapy where I would go for maybe 2 or 3 hour sessions at a time with the trauma therapist. And then at the end of it, I saw her for two-day retreats where we were really able to work through the hardest pieces of the loss together.
Okay, thank you. That is extremely helpful. And you mentioned something that often people with young children who are grieving, that not only do they have to put off that psychological first aid that they need, just the day-to-day grieving. I've talked to so many people who had to limit that to being in the car or in the shower. Do you recall having to isolate your grief from your children, or how did you manage that part?
Some of the advice that the trauma therapist gave me in that very first meeting was to not hide my grief from the kids. Obviously, you don't want them to be overwhelmed where they feel like they then have to take care of you. So it was kind
Hmm.
of a balance. I did have, a lot of crying in the car. I had a lot of crying in the shower. I had a lot of crying with the bathroom door locked, where mommy just needed to be left alone to cry for a few minutes. Um, and then I would, pick myself up and go back out. But I also cried in front of my children. I mourned in front of them. We went to the cemetery together. They saw me be sad, and that also gives them permission then to feel the same, because I think so often what happens with children that are bereaved is they'll see the parent hurting and they'll stuff down those emotions because now I have to take care of mommy or daddy, right? And I have to be strong for mommy or daddy now. And then they become, almost in this parent co-parent role. Maybe I saw this with my 9-year-old as she got older and I was a solo parent. She would try to step in and almost like, act like the other parent. And I'd have to be like, you're 11. Like, you don't get to speak that way to your sister. Like, I'm still parenting and there's only one of me, but this is not your role. You need to be a kid. And it wasn't because I wasn't doing my job. It was just that she felt she was supposed to be grown like that now that dad was gone. Right.
Yes.
And so I think that's the risk when we don't give children space to be kids that mourn. And one of the other things that's real common with kids that I think is sometimes hard for adults to wrap around because our grief is different is they do something called puddle jumping, where they kind of jump into their grief and then they jump right out. Right. So they could be knee deep in it. I had a conversation one day just out of the blue. My kid wanted to know what happened to daddy's brain after he died. Like, while we're driving. Okay, I guess we're going to have this conversation right now, right? And 2 minutes later, it's like talking to me about whatever favorite TV show was on PBS. And so kids only have so much kind of bandwidth for
Hmm.
how much grief they can process at once. And then they need to kind of recalibrate and regulate by going back to normal everyday things. Whereas I feel like for adults, right, we kind of get into our grief and then we got to jump out to go to work or whatever. But we go deeper, and they do too. They just need to do it differently than adults.
Thank you. And speaking of work, going from the separation, your husband passes, two jobs,
Hmm.
mothering, and it sounds like, were you in school at that time too, still doing some studying on top of that?
I was not. I was working for a college when he
Okay.
died, and then
Oh,
I was
okay.
also teaching at another college. So I was adjuncting on Saturdays. I was working a full time job. The year before he died, my mother died, and I had been caregiving for her, and he was getting his doctorate for most of the years my kids were young. And then he had just graduated the year before he died. And so there was this period, the 5 years before he died, where I was working two jobs, he was working part time, he was in residency, he was in school. I was caregiving for my mom. You know, what so often happens to people in our generation in their 30s and 40s, where you're just in that sandwich.
Mm-hmm.
So I also, I like to think that if we had like maybe one or two less stressors, our marriage would have sustained through it. But we were under so much incredible stress,
Mm-hmm.
and there was just kind of a period where it was constantly crisis after crisis. And that was also some of the work I had to do in trauma therapy, was like to look at all the losses I had went through and to grieve the whole of what I lost in 5 years, not not just Mark in my marriage, but I lost a best friend, my mother had died, I lost my grandmother, I lost a pregnancy. Like, it was so much. And when you have that much loss, I think you start telling yourself it's something I did wrong, right? Maybe it was in
Mm-hmm.
another life, but why is God punishing me? What have I done wrong in my life to have so much suffering? And so that was part of it too for me, was kind of like, how do you come through all of that with your identity intact and your mental health intact? And it transformed who I was. Work was the one thing that was stable for me.
Mm-hmm.
Work was the one place in my life where I felt successful still. I didn't feel like everything was falling apart. And about actually the morning he died, I was set to get a big promotion. I had a presentation that I never made it to. And about a year after he died, they gave me grace for a year, and then they came back and said, "We're going to need you to move into this role." And so I became an executive at the center where I was working and took on more work. And so for my kids' early years, I have some regrets that I wasn't more present. They were in after school care a lot. They were in before school care. I was a working mom, and I was a working widowed solo parent for their formative kind of years. And that's something that sometimes I have some regrets about. But I also had to look at the long term of like, how am I going to put two kids through college or pay
Right.
for daycare and after school care if I'm not taking this other job that pays more. So it was always a trade off of like, I can be financially stable or you can have mom more. And it was just this year, my daughter, my oldest, is survived to adulthood. She's in college now, and I made a decision to leave another job I was at where I had a very high profile community job. And I made a decision to step down and take a break this year so that I could be home with her, because I felt like I had missed out on so much of her childhood.
We do have to make a lot of decisions, and those decisions come so quickly. And I found that we made the best decisions we could with the
Right.
knowledge that we have. Everybody can look back at the crystal ball of what we've done already and say, I could have done that differently. But the things that happen in such a rush, you have such little time to address different things. That's why I really recommend for people that have just gotten married or been married for a while to have a lot of conversations about what life would look like when one of us is not here.
Right.
Those are difficult conversations, but oftentimes when we're saying these wedding vows, we're saying, till death do us part. But I don't think a lot of us unpack what that would look like as far as having a will, a trust,
Hmm.
life insurance, all these other different, what type of financial investments are we doing to posture that remaining spouse? Did you and Mark have any of those types of conversations?
I tried. Uh, he was not willing to have them. And if anything, I think really struggled with kind of these adulting tasks, right? We got married young. We were 24. I thought at the time we were grown. I got married again at 42. I can tell you 24 and 42 are drastically different in your
We are going to get to that,
marriage.
yes.
Yeah. So, Mark and I had life insurance. I had a retirement plan. Mark was the opposite of me. He was very type B. He didn't want to deal with those things. But what that meant is when he died, I totaled out at $314 in his retirement saving. He couldn't get life insurance once he got sick. No one would insure
Mm,
someone with epilepsy. And this was always a fear of mine. And it made me hyper independent of like, I can't count on you. And that was an issue in our marriage. And so this time when I got married at 42, it absolutely was like, you want to buy a house? Well, then I need co-survivor rights. you you want to get married? Well, I'm going to need a will and legal guardianship. And it was the opposite because I'd suffered through it and not.
So you mentioned that you remarried. There had to be some dating before you got to him. What did dating look like for you at that point in time?
It was a hot mess. Dating at your late 30s, early 40s, not something I would want to ever do again. Um, so I did not date very long. I met my now husband in a support group for widowed people. That first meetup I mentioned that I went to locally, that was mostly 60 and 70 years old. There was one man in there who looked to be about my age. And we formed a friendship because everyone else was so much older. It's kind of a natural, like, hey, I see you, you look about my age. Let's talk after. And we formed a friendship. And his first wife, then wife, died 2 months before my husband. So it was both our first meeting. We were on kind of a similar trajectory in our grief at that time. And it was really, hard to know if like this was someone I was like, I felt guilty about that, right? Like I shouldn't be hitting on the guy in the widow group. Like, what's wrong with me?
We're
And
human,
yet I found myself attracted to him.
but we're alive. We are
Right.
alive. Yes.
Yes. So there was a period where, we weren't sure if we were just friends. I did not know how to date. I had my 65-year-old therapist tell me that writing him an email to talk about a friends with benefits situation, like it was a business transaction, was a terrible idea, and that I should just ask the man out on a date. So it was like, I didn't know how to do it. I just was kind of like, listen, I don't have a lot of time. This is what I'm looking for. This might work for you. And she was like, no, no.
So how did you do it? How did it work though?
So I was patient with him actually. We joke about it now. Um, I had asked him to coffee after that as a friend, and he canceled on me the morning of, saying he had a work emergency on a Saturday. And I was like, okay, that might be viable. People have work on Saturdays. The second time we scheduled for coffee, he did the exact same thing, and I told myself maybe he's just not ready to be alone with a woman, even a friend. And I was like, I'm not going to continue to pursue this. And a couple of weeks later, he messaged me and was like, listen, we were both having a tough night. And he was like, I think, we should go out sometime and have some fun. And I was like, listen, this doesn't really seem like, I mean, I get a babysitter every time you say that, and then you don't follow through kind of thing. And he was like, no, no, I really did have work emergencies. I really do want to go out. And I didn't know if it was a date. He didn't know if it was a date. I spent all this money getting my hair done and my nails done and a whole new outfit in case it was a date. And then when he kissed me, I was like, oh, this is a date. That's nice. Um, and then I broke up with him for a minute because he wanted children and I had already had two. And I was like, I'm not doing this again at my age. And I thought, he's this great guy and he should go have that life he was supposed to have with his wife. And that's not me. And so I just decided to take control and just cut it off before it got anywhere. And when that lasted all of like a week or two, I remember him asking me like, well, do I get a say in this relationship? Because I actually think I could be happy as a stepdad someday if that was, where we go. And that's where we ended up going. So my dating time was short. I did see one or two other people in the in between, and that was a disaster. And I was kind of like, this guy at least is nice. He may not be the world's best communicator, but he's trying. And once I got to know him, he's very different than anyone else I've ever fallen for. It was definitely not the kind of person I would have gone out of my way to meet. It's very different than my first husband, but turned out to be exactly who I needed. And
Mm.
when we got married, I very much felt the minister said, God didn't abandon us in our darkness. And neither one of us knew that at the time, right? I didn't expect to walk into a support group 3 weeks after my husband died and meet my next husband. And there was definitely, we took it slow because of my children. They didn't even know we were dating for the first year. It was another year before he stayed overnight. It was another year before we stayed at his house. It was another year before we lived together. So we got together quickly, and then we took the relationship really slow for both of us and the kids because we were all healing, right? And his one of the things I learned in dating a widower, right, is his grief is very different than my grief. And for the beginning of our relationship, there were 4 people in our relationship, and 2 of them were dead. And so we had to both navigate how you simultaneously fall in love and experience joy while you're also having your first holidays without your person, while you're having your first anniversary of their death, and like how you manage that as a couple that wants to respect each other's space in their grief and still be there and support each other. And so it was definitely, I'm sure, unlike many other dating stories. But I was really grateful for meeting him when I did, and to be with someone that understands I'm never going to forget Mark, that had no expectation my children would somehow just adopt him as their dad now. Like, he really understood what we were going through because he was going through it too, differently. He had a very different marriage. He was only married 3 years to my 12.
Mm,
He'd only been with his partner a total of 6 years to my 21 years, right? They weren't together long enough to have those ebbs and flows of a marriage over time. So we both had different experiences and expectations about how we would grieve. I think men do grief differently than women. It seems to be, in my experience at least. And so there were ways we had to adjust early on in our relationship. We had to learn to communicate, I think, a lot quicker than a lot of people do and deeper because of what we were going through.
thank you for sharing that. I've heard that having someone that truly understands your journey does make that relationship a little bit different. To be able to understand that space of always, you will love someone else as I
Right.
am loving you. It doesn't diminish what we're at, but it's you've lived this entire life with someone. It impacts the way you move forward. So how you mentioned the timeline. How long did you guys date from, well, I should say from that first meeting to when you got married? What was the time in between?
5 years. It took
Okay.
us 5 years to get married. So we were, like I said, on a slow roll. We got together quickly, and then it
Right.
kind of just kept it real even. In part because I was really afraid of doing marriage again. I was not sure
Mm,
after coming through everything I had been through with Mark that I didn't feel confident in my ability to be,
okay.
someone's wife again. And so I really wanted to work on my own healing and making sure I was ready for marriage again. And he was patient, so I'll give him that. He was he was very patient with me working through my stuff so that we could get to a place where we were both ready. And then we got engaged in 2019. We were supposed to get married. We did get married in June 2020, and when COVID hit, it actually threw
Yes.
me right back into all my PTSD because I thought, I had just done all this work to kind of to get better and to
Hmm.
recover, and then here was this grand, horrible thing that could take everyone I loved away again. And it kind of
Mm,
sent me into a spiral of like, we almost didn't get married because I panicked and was like,
okay.
I can't do, like, I can't go through another loss of a husband again. Um, and so that was a rough, I tell people, one of the things I learned in trauma counseling, right, is we all have these reptile brains. So my lizard brain took over for the first 6 months of COVID. And I was just back in survival mode of like,
Mm.
I can't marry you because what if you die on me? And I couldn't shake that fear that if I reached for some kind of happiness, a catastrophe would happen again.
I think that is such a good point. I would dare say that any widow or widower that is thinking about dating, recoupling, marrying, that thought,
Right.
the inevitable, we're in this situation because our first spouse died.
Right.
And the reality is one of us is going to die again, just who will be
Hmm.
first.
Right.
That can be crippling and prevent people from even thinking about having love or doing that. I know that that is something that I had to struggle with and think, do I want to subject myself? And I'm older. I mean, I was 51 when my late husband passed, and I'm 57 now. So I'm already realizing there's more time behind me than
Right.
there is in front of me. But the gift of being able, if you so desire, to want to it's not for everybody. But I realized for me, it was not something that would prevent me from having this gift of this experience because I just felt like it was worth it. I don't know. Did you struggle with the reality of that past COVID, but the everydayness of it and what that would look like?
Yeah, I mean, it was definitely between the time that I had separated from Mark and the time I moved in with Brian, there was 5 years. And so I had been now in this space of being really independent, hyper independent in some way. So that when I moved in with him, I was like, I don't know if I want to live with a man again. Like, I like the arrangement we had where you come over 2 nights a week, we go there on the weekend, I have a couple of days to myself.
Mm-hmm.
And I wasn't sure I was ready to do full time again, you know.
Mm-hmm.
And then so prior to COVID, so the job I had, I got laid off. And
Mm.
Brian happened to also get laid off. We had this economic downturn in 2018 where
Okay.
we both got laid off in like a 2 week period. And we had been
Wow.
together 4 years at that, 3 years at that point. And it was kind of like, we can't afford two houses. We could afford one house. Is this
Oh,
the right reason to move in together? Like we were heading
okay.
in that direction, you know. We were living there
Okay.
on the weekends. He was staying with me 2 nights a week.
So to
But it
slide you
kind
into
of,
that.
yeah,
Okay.
it kind of forced our hand a bit of like, where do we want this relationship to go? Like, am I going to move my kids into an apartment now because I'm going to lose my house if I don't have a job? Can I trust this person financially? Right. It caused a lot of that. And so I had to really take a step back and do some deep thinking about what I wanted and where I was. And pretty quickly really looked at how supportive he had been to me, how much he cared for my kids, and recognized that like it was really my fear and my guilt getting in the way, and recognizing that I could actually be happy if I stopped sabotaging myself and work through my stuff. And that was a point where I started seeking a different kind of therapy. But I went back to therapy at that point because I recognized that I needed some help kind of working through those fears, and that I did want to be married again and I did want a long term relationship. But I was really afraid of like what it would mean to, what if he died again? And then when COVID did happen, it was one thing in theory to be like, no, I can work through this. One of us will die someday, but I'll be all right. And then all of a sudden, people are dying everywhere. And that just, everything that I thought I did in therapy just got undone with COVID. And so we ended up getting married in our backyard. And we didn't decide until the day before the day we were supposed to get married. I didn't decide. I shouldn't say he. He was in it the whole time. I didn't wake up until that morning and knew that I wanted to do it. And I think it really came down to me deciding that I was not going to heal, and that this would always be my story if I let the narratives control me that I didn't deserve to be happy. And that, this wasn't anybody punishing me. Mark didn't die because I was a bad person. That this was just sometimes what happens in life, right? People will die on you. The people closest to you will die. We will all die. And
Yes.
I really had to grapple with, could I live with that happening again? Could I risk that vulnerability? Because it was kind of okay to love him from like a little bit of a distance, right? But it's a whole nother thing to like commit again.
Yes.
And even with having the house, we had been living together for a year at that point, but I was still like, well, that's still different than marriage because I can walk away. I just got to get out of this mortgage. So I always had a plan B. And so it came down to like, I just woke up in the morning and I remember being like, you know what? I want to be happy and I'm happy and I want to keep being happy. So I'm going to marry you today. And so we got married on Zoom in our backyard. Our minister was in Rochester. We're in Buffalo. We had just the kids and my dad, and his parents came for the first time. We had seen them since the lockdown started, and my other brother was on Zoom, and that was our wedding. And a year and a half after that, we got to have the wedding we planned. Uh,
Okay.
so in 2021, we had our actual second wedding. I call it our sequel wedding, the wedding we wanted. Um,
Hmm.
so now I've actually been married 3 times to 2 different men.
Oh wow. That is a beautiful, beautiful story to share. Um, and now your journey has changed to what are you doing now? I believe you're doing something helping widows in that process. What does that look like for you now?
Yeah. So in 2016, 2 years after I was widowed, I mentioned how I couldn't find a community of other widowed parents. So I started an online, just a Facebook support group called Widowed Parent Project. And I've been growing that the last 7 years. And that has turned into the second year of presence on Twitter. I have a really nice Twitter following and a lot of community engagement there. And last year, when I made the decision to step down as an executive director at a community nonprofit, I really evaluated like, what do I want to do for me? This is my
Mm.
time now, right? My kids are teens, one's in college. I had an opportunity to say, I've got this great partner that is supporting me, and I don't have to do everything alone anymore. And maybe it's time to really give myself some space to grow. And so I decided to move into consulting full time. So I have a nonprofit management side of that I do and kind of take those skills and work in the community still around health equity. And then I've also started doing coaching for widowed people, and that's been really fulfilling work. So I see clients privately as a coach and work with them kind of in this life after loss. It's different than therapy, right? I'm not a therapist. So I always tell people like coaching is best when you're ready to move forward, when you're ready to be actionable about what you want your life to look like in the after, right? Because to me, there's always a before and after when there's loss. So when you're ready to focus on the after and who you want to be and redo that identity work, a coach can be really helpful for that, especially someone with lived experience with loss, because I know what you've been through, right? I've been through it. And we can kind of look at, what are some of the tools and skills you can develop going forward in your life. Because for me, it was very much a phoenix process. I had to say goodbye to the life I had, the Jen I was with Mark, Jen and Mark. Jen died when Mark died. I can't go back to who I was before him or who I was after his, right? Who I was when he died. So all I could do was kind of rebuild a new life. And my life I have now is beautiful and wonderful. And it is so wholly different than the life I had before. And there was a lot of work to get here. And so I want to kind of help be that guide and kind of pay forward what was gifted to me from other mentors. And so I've been doing that work. And I've also taken me 10 years, it'll be 10 years in 2024 since he died. And during this time, very slowly, I've been writing my memoir. And so my memoir is coming out in the spring. It's called Shipwrecked. It's a memoir on widowed parenting and life after loss. And it's kind of moving through this process of how do you rebuild when you felt like your life shipwrecked, right? And how do you move from feeling like you want to die when your person dies to being able to actually set sail again and take those risks and do those hard things and those challenging things and live your one beautiful, precious life for you now. And I think that that is what, um, people talk about like gifts and death and gifts and grief. And a lot of people don't like that idea. And I don't think it's for everyone, but I have found gifts in my grief. And some of the gifts I've gotten from Mark and is this bond that has persisted even after he died. Our love has not died. He died. His body died. Our spiritual connection is deeper now than it ever was before. I feel him with me all of the time. And I wanted to honor his life he didn't get to live by living mine happily and knowing that that's what he would want for me. And so I kind of detailed all that in the memoir. And I also wanted there to be a real practical hands-on guide, like the book I wanted that I went looking for at the bookstore that wasn't there, on how do you raise grieving kids? How do you help your children when you're heartbroken, right? How do you move your family forward? And how do you reimagine a life after loss as a family? And so that's the book I ended up writing, and it's coming out in the spring. And yeah, that's what I've been doing now.
Nice. I hope to get a copy of that. It sounds like it would be very a well-read book and a guide on what people need to do. A couple of things, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
You mentioned about the coaching. What, how do you meet with people? Is there a limit to where people live that you can support them?
Right. So thanks to the internet and Zoom, when it decides to cooperate with me, I do virtual coaching. So we just meet like this. And, I do an assessment in the beginning and kind of talk to people about what they've done on their work on their grief, where they want to envision their life. Every client is different. Some people really want to focus more on very practical things like how do I learn to be more independent? How do I make decisions by myself? How do I parent without a partner and just deal with the day-to-day stress of that? And how can we do, what are some things we can do as a family to make meaning of what has happened? For other people, it's really more about the grief process. And even though it's not therapy, we're more focused on like skills based ways that they can find support and resources and helping them identify that. So it really varies on what the individual needs of each client are. I try to make sure that the coaching I'm doing is useful to them, right? And it's not like there's a program and we work the program. It's very individualized to what their particular situation is. Um, but I've shared my contact information with you. So I also really want coaching to be affordable for widow people. There's so much financial need after you're widowed. I try to make it very affordable, much more affordable than therapy. Not saying you shouldn't do therapy, but I recognize as an addition, it's a lot. And so I'm trying to have this be a lot of the meaningful work I do and how I give back to the communities by keeping this very affordable so that people can get support in community. And I think the two biggest things that made a difference for me were finding community and finding my purpose. And once I was able to do those two things, I was amazed how quickly things kind of fell into place for me in my healing. And it was very hard. Like I said, it was a lot of work to go through psychologically, emotionally. I like to think I've done a lot of work on myself and I'm still growing and I'm still learning. But I can also tell you that as a parent now, with my kids being almost 10 years out, the best thing I did for my kids was take care of myself. And by being okay, they're okay. And they're thriving now. And I really think that the investment in our mental health through therapy, through community support, through some of the coaching that I was a beneficiary of, all of that helped us be who we are today. And I think Mark would be very proud of who the three of us are today.
Beautiful. You mentioned it's virtual. Is there a limit to locations where people are at that you can support them, or if they have Zoom or have the
Usually, as
ability
long as
to?
they have Zoom and as long as our time zones work, we can
Right.
we can make it work. I have been much better generally about holding a boundary around my own time now. I'm not working
Okay.
80 hours a week anymore, so I don't tend to do as much evening or weekend thing, but I will. I'll try to make a late afternoon work for someone, or if they
Okay.
really need a Saturday because they're a widow parent, that's all they got, we'll make that work. Um, but I hope the coaching is a way for people, not everyone needs it long term, right? It isn't therapy. Maybe you just need a couple of sessions to kind of talk through some family problems. I often find that the parents that have the hardest time aren't the ones with the littles. It's the teenagers and the young adult children that are sometimes the hardest to work with because they are not going to accept mom or dad dating again. They're not going to want to process
Oh,
their grief with you, right? When they're little, you can kind of control their environment a little bit more, not so much the older ones. And so some of the clients I work with, a lot of it is, more that relationship building and talking to their adult children or talking to their teenage children about their grief and trying to help give them some skills for how to have those conversations. Because I think grief as a whole is something we don't do really well in America or in the world, right? And so people don't have these skills. They don't know how you have conversations with your kids. And a lot of people think that, you talk, when I read the chapter in the book about how to talk to your children when your partner dies, everyone assumes it's like a one and done. That's not ever been widowed. And I'm like, no, no, no. You're going to talk to those children about the death and the loss for the rest of their life. And those
yes.
conversations are going to shift over time. And you're going to be with them in their sadness and in their shock, and then in their anger, and then their anger at you, and then their guilt, and then their reshock. And you have to know how to pivot as a parent. No one teaches that. It's not in the, how to be, what to expect when you're expecting guidebook, right? None
Yes,
of
I
that.
read that.
So I try to be there as a resource to like, I don't have all the answers, but here's what I know from trauma therapy that works well. Here's what I know from my background in education and psychology and child development that works well. Here's some tools that worked for me. Maybe they'll work for your family, or let's talk about what you think as an expert on your own life would work in your family. And we try to find those tools and resources to help parents get through that, or tune inward, and maybe it is their own identity work that they need to do. It's a lot of reimagining. Maybe it's financial that is the pressing problem, right? And then we have to think creatively about income. So again, I try to meet people where they are and support them for however long they need support to kind of get to that next phase of their growth.
Thank you. Is this men and women that you're supporting?
Right now it's been only women, but I'm open
Okay.
to having men too. It's not for, I think it's harder for men to ask for help. I
Okay.
think that's another thing in our society, right? On Twitter, I do engage with a lot of widowers, and so I seem to have a lot more men engage with me on that platform than I do in the Facebook group. But I do, I just started the coaching, so this is very new. And right now, I'm just serving women, but I'm open to both men and women, and it doesn't have to be a widowed parent. I'm really open to working with widowed people of all ages and stages in their grief. Um, I usually find that it's best for people to be at least 6 months out, if not a year out from the loss, because they have to have time to process, right? And to kind of go through that initial grief. And that's where that community support and therapy may be most helpful. And then most of the people I'm seeing now, the couple I'm seeing are more like in the 2 to 4 year range, where it's like they got through what they think is the worst of it, and now what, right? What comes next? Because it's not always clear what's supposed to happen. Like you get through the terrible thing, and then what
Right.
on the other side of it? And so that's a really good place where coaching can help them think about what's next.
Okay. Um, for example, just to give someone an idea of how you would help them, if someone, and I know this is a broad question, but someone that is stuck in
Mm.
grief and they're trying to find an action or a process to go forward, what are some ideas or things that people could consider?
Right. So one of the things that I'm assessing, as I said, I have a background in mental health and trauma counseling, but I'm not a licensed counselor. So one of the things that I am looking for though is, are they stuck because there is something like guilt or shame or some deep seated kind of emotional health issue? Then I will refer them to therapy because that's not appropriate for coaching, right? So if they're stuck because I was stuck in my guilt about how he died, I needed a therapist to support that. If they're stuck because they can't envision a life without this person, or because they've never lived alone, or because they feel overwhelmed by the loneliness and all the possibilities, then that's where coaching can come in and be helpful. One of the things that I think some of my clients have found helpful was just learning about different models of grief. I interviewed 30 widowed parents for the work I've been doing on my research project for the book, and only one of them knew any of the more modern theories on grief. All we hear about are the 5 stages of grief. It's a 50-plus-year-old theory at this point, and there's no evidence backing it up, right? So one of the things I try to do in coaching is to educate people about some of the newer models of grief, particularly around family bereavement, to say, maybe some of this makes sense to you and applies to you. So let's talk about, for example, the dual processing model where, right, you swing from the past to the present. That is perfectly normal. People think there's something wrong with them if they are, 1 minute going to the cemetery. And this was, for me, I went one day on I was going to buy my wedding dress to marry Brian, and it was the anniversary of my husband's death. And so I went to the cemetery before to buy a wedding gown. And I remember when I shared that on Twitter, someone got really angry with me and they were like, you can't love, like, you're doing a disservice to both of those men. You can't possibly love one this way and one that way. And I was like, actually, you can. And this is one of the other gifts in my grief. I can love more than one person, just like I love both of my children, right? My heart expanded to have this other man in my life. And the dual processing model is this movement from the past to the future. And you have to kind of swing on that pendulum to process your grief so that you can move into a future that is healed and whole. I didn't know about that model until I started trying to do my research for the book. And when I learned about it, I was like, this makes so much sense to me. That's actually what I've been living. I didn't have a name for it. I didn't know it was a thing. So learning about that really helped me stop feeling guilty about that movement from the past to the future. Because that's actually what we do to heal our grief. I just didn't know that. So that's like something I might share with someone that feels stuck is like, it's okay to go to the past, and it's okay to also think about your future. You have to have that movement, and sometimes we get stuck in the middle, and that's because either we're scared to go back to the past or we're scared to go forward. And so we might break down, like, what is it that feels overwhelming about being in the middle? Is it scary because it was in the past? Is it scary because it's in the future? And then we work through some of that together and try to come up with some real actionable. I'm all about the baby steps, right? We don't have to change your whole life, but can we take some baby steps together that'll help you take a step forward?
Thank
And
you.
we
I think
do
that,
that and do that until suddenly you're changed, right?
yes, that gives someone a concept. Thank you. That's very helpful. I know we've been talking for a while. I have two final questions for
Okay.
you. What gives you joy?
So many things right now, and they're little things. I have become obsessed with birding, like a newfound thing for me. I love, we moved out to the country, my current husband and I, and I've always been a city girl. And I love that I watch the birds now. I have birds that come to my bird feeders. I've gotten really into like identifying the different species. It's these little things that I didn't make time in my life for before Mark died. I was always run, 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 do, 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 achieve, achieve, achieve. I had to relearn how to connect to simple joys. And so my simple joy is I get my coffee in the morning and I sit here in my sunroom and I have a little winter bird feeding station and the birds still come in the winter and it gives me a lot of joy. Same thing with fish. I have a fish pond here. I love these fish. I've named them all. They come and live inside of my tank in the winter and they're my kids joke that they're my other children. I'm like crazy bird lady, crazy fish lady. But this connection to nature, well, I've always had a connection to nature, this kind of caretaking of nature is something new to me. And that brings me like these little joys every day. One of the other things that was really healing for me and that I worked through in my healing process, because I didn't know what brought me joy. All I had was so much grief. And at one point, a therapist said to me, "What brought you joy as a child?" And I had to really think about that. And I remember that when I was little, I used to love to paint. And then somebody told me my painting was terrible when I was in like Catholic school and I never painted again, right? So when I was 35, I bought paints again and I painted and I've been painting for the last 5 years now, 10 years now, and I love it. And that has been a really important part of my new life.
Nice. My final question. If you could speak to younger you, what age or period of your life would you choose and what would you tell her?
I think I would go back to those really awful years. So from 2010 to 2014 when I was losing everyone I loved. And that kind of culminated in Mark's death being thankfully, the last death. Um, I think I would tell her to hold on and that she has it in her. All the answers she needs, she has in her. She just doesn't know that she's going to be the one to pull her through it. I think I just wish now so much I could go back and hold that part of me. And I did. That was some of the work I did in therapy was to really imagine going back and telling my younger self, like, you're going to get through this. It's going to be okay. It's going to suck for a really long time, but you are strong enough and you are wise enough and you can heal yourself. Everything you need is within you. I didn't believe that when I was younger. I didn't think I was good enough, smart enough, all the things enough. And now I know I am enough and not perfect by any means, but I was enough. And I know that in my 40s in a way I didn't know in my 30s. And I wish I could go back and let her know that she is doing the best she can with what she has at the time.
Thank you. Thank you for making this time. I will allow you to close out this conversation and maybe talk about any points you wanted to that we didn't cover, and I'll let you wrap this up for us.
Thank you so much. And thank you again for taking the time to talk with me, Tina. Thank you for stalking me on Twitter. I love meeting Twitter followers, and it's really cool actually when they like slide into the DMs and I'm like, oh, you're a real person. And so
Yes.
thank you so much for like being a real person with me. I reflect back on it's crazy to me that it's going to be 10 years in 2024 like that. The weight of it being the 10 years coming up is a lot. I think it really, I had a friend recently that was going through a different kind of trauma, but a really, really traumatic experience. And he said, I know your trauma has been very different, but I need someone to tell me how I get through this because I don't want to live. And I said to him, you need to find community and you need to find your purpose. And if you can survive until you find those two things, you will be okay. And I'm really pleased to say he took that to heart. He did the work, and a year later, he's out here telling people community and purpose. And so I was blessed. The woman that started or that connected me to that meetup group, even though the group didn't work out for me, she mentored me. She befriended me. I think of her all the time. I had a woman from the Epilepsy Association, Reverend Lauren, whose husband died of SUDEP, and they connected me to her. And she was a woman, a minister in Maryland. I've never met her in real life, but she shepherded me through the worst of my grief. And so I try to pay forward the gifts that other people, other women have given me in my deepest grief, to be there for someone else now. And I think that's what the purpose and meaning of life, right? It's like paying forward what you've been gifted and giving that to others. So thank you for this opportunity. I hope people will read the book when it comes out. I will be self-publishing it, so you can buy it through Amazon and through Barnes and Nobles and through my website. It is called Shipwrecked. It's a memoir of widowed parenting. And if anyone is interested in coaching, I'd love to connect. Slide into my DMs on Twitter. And one of these days, I'll get up on Instagram. I'm working on that. I'm never going to do TikTok. I refuse. But I would love to meet more of the followers like this and to share with you what I've learned. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you.
Thank you for spending another episode with Widowhood Real Talk. If you found the contents of today helpful, share the episode to anyone you know who may need it. Subscribe to the show and tune into Widowhood Real Talk each week. Then visit widowhood-realtalkwithtina.org to join the community and access additional resources. Remember, you are not alone in this journey.